Okay, I got to ask you, have you ever had one of those bad dreams? You know, the kind where in the dream, you show up late for class, but you forgot to wear pants, and everybody else is ready for a test you didn't even know about? You know you've all had those dreams. But as much as we all hate those dreams, it is far worse when ridiculous circumstances in real life are brought on by the ridiculous inability of others to cope or to act or to lead. And that, my friends, that right there is where we've been for the last 4 years. An endless loop of jackassery, foisted on us by people who cannot cope or act or lead. An endless loop of dreamlike jackassery. It reminds me of a trip my wife and I took in our first few years of marriage. So, we were the epitome of poor young newlyweds. We never got to go anywhere. So the chance to fly to a staff conference in Colorado, it felt very grown up, if you know what I'm saying. In those days before digital everything, the national office made our flight arrangements and they sent us our tickets. So as we made the drive over to Hartsfield International Airport in Atlanta, my lovely young bride pulled out the tickets and slowly turned to me asking, "Mark Air? What's Mark Air? There's no seat numbers. What kind of a jackleg flight do you have us on?" Well, I didn't know. I told her it was going to be fine. And thus began the endless loop of jackassery. So as neophyte travelers, we arrived at the vastness of Hartsfield International, and of course, Mark Air, our airline, had the last possible baggage check. So we were now running late. And I asked the zombie lady who was working at the ticket counter if a meal would be served in flight, and she stared benignly at me like a cow chewing her cud and said, "You've never flown Mark Air before, have you?" And then she unceremoniously handed us some coupons for fast food. So yeah, the odyssey was underway. So we exhaustedly trekked about a half a mile, to a 10-minute train ride, to another half-mile walk, to the last gate in the last terminal, and upon arrival at our gate, we saw over 100 people standing just morosely in line at the gate. I asked one of the other victims who was standing around. In a defeated tone, he grumbled, "Oh, you've never flown Mark Air before." Turns out seating on our flight was first come, first serve. So by now my ever-sweet wife was glaring at me. And I assured her, "We will get on the plane." At which point the guy next to me says, "Oh, you've never flown Mark Air before." It was like some strange mantra that was being chanted over and over again by the depressed masses of Mark Air captives. Well, to make it more fun, the flight was oversold. "Oversold?" I asked out loud, at which point a lady actually turned around to me with pitiful understanding and said, "Oh, you've never flown Mark Air before." Apparently overselling was one of their tactics. Well, lo and behold, we got the last 2 seats on the back row by the toilets. You know, the seats that are pressed up against the lavatory wall so you can't lean back at all. The same seat that bears the fragrance of that beautiful chemical blue water that can only come from an airplane toilet. The ultimate in not first class. But if you've ever been stuck in airport purgatory and all they have left is a back row seat by the toilet, you know you jump on it like a spider monkey on a donut. So yeah, we made it on the plane. And neither one of us had eaten because we couldn't risk getting out of the boarding line. So I heroically commented to my disheveled bride that I'd asked for some extra peanuts from the stewardess. And I kid you not, the guy sitting to our left on the back row by the toilets, he says, "Oh, you've never flown Mark Air before." Well, in the Mark Air jackassery loop, you had to pay separately for peanuts, Cokes, coffee, water, and all of it had to be paid in cash. Well, $10 later, we had 2 soft drinks and some underwhelming little bags of pretzels. Nothing made sense in that bad dream. Everything was more painful than it should have been. I mean, weren't we the paying customers? It was a jackassery loop, to be sure. Well, the epilogue of that story, by the way, is that Mark Air went into bankruptcy and soon thereafter became another afterthought in U.S. aviation history. And the failure of Mark Air, by the way, was really the ostentatious and completely insensitive manner in which they made every aspect of traveling more painful than it had to be. And therein lies my point. You see, these past 4 years that we've been in, the people in authority have made everything about our lives more painful than it had to be. It's as if we were stuck in some kind of bad dream where things made no sense. We've been passengers on the most awful left-wing travel service with every one of us having to sit in the back row by the toilets. Government intrusion into our daily lives has accelerated to levels never seen before, and yet it also seemed increasingly bloated and ridiculously inefficient. The progressive left was so empowered, they treated our very culture as a big laboratory for their experiments. Gender fluidity? Sure. Soft on crime? Why not? Retooling the private sector auto industry? Of course. Open borders? Thank you, sir. May I have another? The economy is great. Iran is our friend. Riots are just largely peaceful protests. 4 long years of an anything goes, nothing is off limits left-wing smorgasbord. And if you ask questions, you're among the unclean, barely worthy of the government who assigned you a back seat in the toilets. But we took it back. Yeah, we did. As I record this particular podcast, we are just 2 weeks away from that most epic of elections. And as surely as Mark Ayer went bankrupt due to awful service, the people of America looked at what the left was doing to our country and spoke up on Election Day and said, "Stop the madness." So yeah, Mark Ayer was a failed airline because it punished its passengers for daring to buy a ticket on their flights. Well, the progressive left has spent the last 4 years punishing us for just apparently letting Americans be Americans. And they lost the election because at every turn, they decided to punish us for just simply being. Well, for the past quadrennium, every seat on the left-wing airlines was indeed a back row by the toilets. It was an endless, dreamlike loop of jackassery. And now, just like good old Mark Ayer, they're out of business too. But I tell you that story partly because it's funny, but partly because we have to be willing to remember. You see, it's so easy in a free society to move past things and just breathe a sigh of relief and then begin to let it fade from our collective memories. We should remember, though. We should remember those past 4 years. I mean, as surely as I never would have set foot on a Mark airline flight again, we as a people should never allow ourselves to be so put upon by our government ever again, ever. We can forgive those who wrong us, but forgiveness does not mean that we allow it to happen again. I mean, I've said before that there's a vast difference in not condemning and simply condoning. I can choose to let the liberal progressive leave office and leave our media and leave our daily lives, but I do not have to forget what happened. By remembering the pain, we avoid it in the future. By forgetting our past, we condemn ourselves to repeat it, and we cannot allow that to happen. But yet, time and time again, society actually forgets. Years ago, I was doing some land navigation training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. That was always one of my favorite things to do. Just give me a good old map, a compass, and a protractor, and a stubby pencil, and just set me loose in the woods, and I'd be content for hours navigating by terrain association or following an azimuth on my compass. But on that particular day at Fort Knox, I broke through some brush, and I came upon an old cemetery out in the middle of nowhere. And I had to stop what I was doing and look at some of the old weathered headstones and the foot markers. I mean, most of which dated back to the early mid-1800s. There was an old wrought iron fence around the perimeter, and the whole graveyard wasn't but about 50 feet by 50 feet, and I found myself wondering, does anyone even know this is here? But then I remembered my map, and sure enough, I realized I had stumbled upon a known site. It was marked on my map as the Lincoln Cemetery. It was actually where Abraham Lincoln's mother was buried. Of course, that also allowed me to exactly confirm my location on the land nav exercise, and I moved off to navigate further. But I remembered that moment because there was a story that came out in the press just about a year ago, right here in Alabama. Apparently, in the Brighton community in Jefferson County, firefighters were called out to a brush fire. It was burning several acres deep in the woods, and firefighters from Brighton and Lipscomb and Birmingham all responded, and when they did, they were all surprised to find an abandoned cemetery deep in the woods. Well, Brighton's assistant fire chief, he said the graveyard had at least 20 grave sites, all of which were in various states of disrepair, dating back over 100 years. Photos that I saw in the article that I read showed broken headstones and one collapsed tomb vault and mature trees grown up in and around the graves. But the thing that got me in the article was not just that they found it, but that when he was talking about it, the fire chief said, nobody knew it was there. How does it get to the point that no one knows that a cemetery is there? Is there no loved one left to visit? Nobody to put flowers on the graves? Is there no local ordinance regarding care and maintenance? 20 graves of actual people, and nobody knew it was there. That's unreal. But it's also a clear indication, y'all, that we can in fact forget our history if we're not careful. I mean, I would like to believe that history cannot repeat itself because surely there's those who will teach it to the next generation. But the reality is that as surely as a community can forget that a cemetery even exists at all, that we as a nation can forget our history, our sacrifices, our heritage, even the things that happened just in the last 4 years. And it happens just by simple neglect. And it wouldn't be the first time, would not be the first time in society that a people have forgotten their own history. In the book of 2 Kings, and also again in 2 Chronicles, we find the story of King Josiah. Josiah was the king of Israel. But his grandfather was King Manasseh, who is said to have turned the entire nation away from God. Manasseh's own leadership had resulted in such a decline that by the time his grandson Josiah took the throne at the early age of 8 years old, the nation was completely and utterly away from its heritage. Well, Josiah, like I said, was just 8. He had no one to teach him, no one to tell him what great things his ancestors had overcome to build the kingdom that he now ruled, and it was so bad that when Josiah turned 20, he decided that the great temple needed to be refurbished. Not so much because he wanted to turn the nation back to its roots, but more because it had fallen into such disrepair and it was being used as a brothel. Well, during the renovations, one of Josiah's elders named Hilkiah came to him, told him that during the renovations, the workers had discovered a book. That's what he called it, just a book. When he asked to see it, Josiah determined that it was the book of the law, basically the Bible, which Israel, despite being founded on the premise of being God's people and the many miracles and the battles and the building of a new nation, the book of the law, the Bible basically, had been forgotten, lost even, to the extent that the king had never even heard of it. He didn't know what it was. No one had ever told him, and he's the king of Israel. But we're told further that when he read it, Josiah realized what had been lost, and so he called a great public assembly. And he read the book to the people. He began to change society, to change culture, to change the nation, all because he rediscovered that which had been lost. The end of Josiah's story says that he died and that no king before him nor after him ever served God with all of his heart, with all his strength like Josiah. What a eulogy. But look, I say that because key to that story is the fact that they had lost their history. We're just barely removed. The election was just 2 weeks ago. We're not even to the inaugural yet as I record this. But already I think some people begin to forget the things that we've experienced over the last 4 years, and we can't do that. Not that we're holding on to it like a grudge, but what I'm saying is we're holding on to it as a memory of what cannot be repeated. Like the first cemetery I talked about. We have to keep it firmly fixed on the map. History must not only be recorded and remembered, but it has to be taught, it has to be shared, and it has to be acted upon. If we don't, then one day we will be like the burning, forgotten cemetery lost in the middle of the woods. Well, not on my watch, not if I can help it. So in the days to come, we as a society will have a new ability to move past the rhetoric, the rancor, and the rashness of what the progressive left did for the last few years. And while we begin to change things and put things in place that they don't like, they will scream and cry and try to pretend that we're hurting their version of the truth. And some will blanch from the feigned pain that the left will rage about. People who are weak in the knees won't be able to follow through on fixing what they broke. But we cannot lose heart. We cannot lose steam. We cannot slow the progress of restoring what they so readily broke over the last 4 years. And in order to get that done, we have to remember. We have to remember so we can move past it. And I'll be honest with you, the world is watching. The world is watching. It is. The world needs America to bow up. The world needs us back on our feet. And the only way we can do that is to take the last 4 years we've been in and then channel it into a deep resolve and then pray and then work. And you only do that when we as a people remember what we've been going through. So think about who we are as a people. Let it set in. Think about that, the view that others have of us, and never ever forget what the left did and why we have to regain that lost ground. I'll close with this. I have a book on the shelf behind me titled Reagan in His Own Hand. It's a compilation of the handwritten speeches of Ronald Reagan throughout the years. He was a prolific writer. He self-drafted most of his speeches. And Ronald Reagan believed in his core in the greatness of America. And in one of those speeches he delivered in 1976, it was titled The Hope of Mankind. He was talking about America. And at one point in the manuscript of his speech, Reagan actually quoted a British citizen who had written an open letter to the London Daily Mail just a few months before the speech. In that letter, the letter's author, Sir Ferdinand Mount, he wrote to the British Society and other Europeans who were chastising the United States, and he said this. He said, "What the world needs now is more Americans." He said the U.S. is the first nation on earth deliberately dedicated to letting people choose what they want and giving them a chance to get it. For all of its terrible faults, he said, in one sense, America still is the last best hope of mankind because it spells out so vividly, he said, the kind of happiness which most people actually want, regardless of what they are told they ought to want. And we criticize, he said. Yet we copy, we patronize, we idolize, we insult, but we never doubt that the U.S. has a unique position in the history of human hopes. For it is the only nation founded solely on a moral dream, he said. A part of our future is tied up in it, and the greatest of all gifts the Americans have given us all is hope. What great words. What great words. But in order to achieve the greatness and to pursue all the possibilities that we have in front of us, we have to also remember where we've been. Remember where we've been. Remember who we are, providing people of each next generation a sense of their own connectivity to the past. That will only serve to enable them to better appreciate their future. And sometimes that memory is not so far back. For us, right now, those of us on the conservative right, as we move into this new quadrennium, as the Trump team takes office in the wake of the 2024 elections, we have to remember the past 4 years and make it the rallying cry for the next 4 years. It is an intentional thing. It is something that won't happen unless we take it on as a mission, a purposeful mission, to tie our past to our present. That's how we preserve and promote who we are as a people, by putting all of the past sacrifices, the victories, the achievements, even the losses into perspective. We preserve freedom by knowing and appreciating where we've been and who we are as a people. As Winston Churchill once said, a nation that forgets its past has no future. So yeah, we have to strive to always remember so that we never forget. I don't ever want to repeat the Biden years. Never. I'd rather go fly on Mark Air again, back row by the toilets, you know. That's my philosophy.